Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. China has confirmed it's building a fourth aircraft carrier in its bid to close the gap on the US and the world's largest carrier fleet. Experts are expecting China's fourth carrier to be nuclear powered, like American and French carriers, with virtually unlimited range. We ask what message China is sending, where Beijing intends to use its carriers, and why China is determined to build a blue water navy. Joining us today are Wen-Ti Sung, National Chengchi University Department of Political Science Professor, and Wen-Ti Sung, Atlantic Council Global China Hub Non-Resident Fellow. A very warm welcome to both of you on the show today. Aircraft carriers, a military's most visible symbol of power and force projection, are once again in the global spotlight. A day after Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, Washington ordered a carrier to the Mediterranean to protect ally Israel and stationed another in the Red Sea to protect commercial vessels from Iranian-backed Houthi attacks. In January, when Taiwan held its pivotal elections, a carrier was positioned just east of Taiwan. Experts say that without aircraft carriers, countering an invasion of Taiwan will be impossible. And yet, as funds in Washington for the next generation US carrier fall behind, China is gaining pace, with Navy shipbuilding driving its military modernization. Professor Su, let me come to you first. What message does China's fourth aircraft carrier send?
Yeah, it is evident that China plans to increase its military capacity to pursue its geopolitical goal of dominating the East Asia Pacific region. So increased tensions are expected in the areas of South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. However, it is still too early to tell whether such a military advancement will pose greater threats to the U.S. Maritime supremacy. One important reason is that, unlike the U.S., China still currently doesn't have extensive military bases overseas.
Okay, so Wen-Ti, so does that mean that the U.S. doesn't need to worry about this fourth aircraft carrier?
I think when there is military balance shifting in the region, then it's going to be a concern to countries in the region, as well as the U.S., which, as we all know, is a major security provider and public goods provider for the peace and stability of Taiwan surrounding, as well as the Indo-Pacific region in general. So I think, of course, with new advent of a major piece of military asset like a fourth aircraft carrier for China, for example, that would be a matter of concern for a country in the region, including the U.S.
And Professor, what do you think the position of an aircraft carrier is within a navy, within the China's navy?
Well, the aircraft carrier is a very important weaponry for projecting, global naval power, and so basically it has a very important role, and
so it's symbolically, it's politically.
Yeah, well,
important.
both, and substantively, it can be an important signal for the United States, because it. Clearly, it's a possible and potential signal for challenging the dominance of the United States.
Wen-Ti, so Admiral John Aquilino, commander of the US Indo-Pacific Command, recently wrote that China's military buildup is expanding at a rate not seen since World War II. And this, he said, was across land, sea, air, space, cyber information. Let me just quote to you something that China's Navy political commissar, Yuan Huazi, said. He said, "We are building aircraft carriers to protect our national sovereignty and to protect our territorial integrity." So they would also say that this is why they're building up their military as a whole. What do you think about that statement?
Well, that's a multi-pronged question in a way, but yeah, I think there's always going to be a connection between growth in capability and a rising concern about what's the intention behind or driving that growth in capability, in this case, China. And we know that from that quote you just mentioned from the political commissar from the Chinese side, for example, he talks about how they are building more military assets, including aircraft carrier, as an attempt to improve ability to defend territorial integrity, sovereignty. So I mean, the question here is really who does China realistically think is posing a threat to China's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Because at this moment, it doesn't seem like any conceivable actor is interested in launching anything near a military invasion of China. So if there's no true immediate conceivable need for defense, then the purpose behind it, people will think may be offense, that China may be thinking about using that newfound capability on places more far away from its shore. And that's what's driving this increasing security concern in the region.
Professor, Wen-Ti just said that there's no one that's challenging China's territory, but if we get into, say like India, China would claim that Arunachal Pradesh is theirs. India says that no, it's theirs. So we can also see the Chinese side of things, can we?
Yeah.
I mean that obviously wouldn't require aircraft carriers, but it's simply an example about territorial disputes.
Yeah, well, there are various territorial disputes. Clearly, in my opinion, I think the real focus right now is in South China Sea, and as Wen-Ti just said, is it really necessary for for China to build an aircraft carrier for the purpose of defense? I don't really think so. So I think that the statement made by China should be rephrased, that they, what they really want to do is to build aircraft carrier to expand its territorial claims. Yeah.
So it's because it itself is expansionist.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Wen-Ti, let's go back to the fourth carrier. And let's look at it in terms of the speed of China's buildup of its, so this will be the fourth one. We've got some dates there for you. If you could assess for us the speed of that development.
I guess you can see from the screen there, that's about 7 years gap from the time when China got their first aircraft carrier, but it's one they bought from, I believe, Ukraine, that they acquired from abroad. And then it took them 7 years from that point to reverse engineer and to come out with their own aircraft carrier, and that's the second one, Shandong in 2019. 7 years, and then it takes 5 more years to get the third one, which again raises question about maybe they'll be thinking about more down the road. And this is consistent with the general trend we've been seeing from China in recent years as well. I think it was the US Indo-Pac commander who talked about remarkable growth of China's military power over the last 3 years. We're seeing something in the magnitude of 400 new warplanes in 3 years, 200 new warships, roughly a doubling of the conventional missile inventory, as well as something near a doubling of the nuclear warheads as well. All these are indicators of increasing interest in building up a strong army and a strong military across the services in general, of course, which again calls into question for what conceivable purpose do they plan to use that on?
Exactly, and Professor, I mean, Aquilino said it there, didn't he? He said at a rate not seen since World War II. So that would seem that he's saying that they're going on a war footing.
Well, it's possible, but I think everyone, especially these important actors, are making preparation for this possible conflicts, and the U.S. clearly pay very close attention to this recent development.
And Wen-Ti, we saw that the third carrier, the Fujian one, in terms of innovations, had a electromagnetic catapult. It's expected to be launch commissioned this year, and that was a huge step up, wasn't it, to have that technology, which would basically speed the number of planes that can lift off from the aircraft carrier. Now this fourth one has another innovation or step up. What can you tell us about that?
The fourth one, I mean, they are working towards, I think it's still, detail is still vague at this point, I think, but I think the general trend is that they're working towards potentially developing their own nuclear power aircraft carrier down the road. And this, I think, is it's kind of interesting as well. Why would they think about that direction? One straightforward possibility is that they maybe think about symbolic concern, that they feel like because U.S. has it, maybe China also want to have it, and once they have it, maybe give them that status as a true peer competitor to the U.S.
Right. So you don't actually see, the fact that it can go without needing to be refilled so frequently, that this feature would actually be used by China. You don't see that that's a reason why it would be seeking this? It's simply that sort of status symbol.
I mean, it's, of course, if they do get nuclear power aircraft carrier, it's nice. It gives them greater range. It gives them ability to operate for longer, far away from the shores. And they don't need to refuel nearly as often, and that gives them greater range, ability to project power beyond China's immediate region. So in that sense, that gives them the feeling that henceforth China will no longer be just a regional power, but rather it's a global power that can operate meaningfully in other regions as well. So in that sense, yes, it's got symbolic and it's also got military utility. But again, just because you got nearly infinite energy doesn't mean that people on board don't need to eat. So those resupplying, rationing concerns still, even with a nuclear power aircraft carrier, China's Navy still is going to need it. And for that ability to resupply, not just refill, they need friendly countries around the world who are able to give them port access for military purposes. And that's something that China at this juncture is still struggling with, which is why I'm saying so many things have to go right, have to be in place for that nuclear power aircraft carrier to be meaningful militarily for China.
Okay, and it's not something that the US struggles with, Professor, is it, in terms of bases, friendly bases in the Asia region?
Yeah, well, currently, of course, there are numerous overseas military bases of the U.S. So that is some kind of infrastructure that China is actually seeking to build, which is probably through its Belt and Road Initiative, because as we can see, China has signed a lot of contracts with various countries to build ports, although China claims that these ports are mainly for the purpose of international trade and economic development, but we cannot ignore the possibility that China in the near future might turn to use these ports for military purposes.
Okay. Now, to find out more about how China may use its carriers, I spoke with Malcolm Davis of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. I began by asking what this fourth carrier would enable Beijing to do.
It gives China the ability to encircle Taiwan and conduct air operations from the sea against Taiwan from any direction, which is dramatically different from essentially a land-based air force that can only operate from mainland China. So it does give the PLA much more operational flexibility against Taiwan. In the future, as it builds up its carrier forces, there's a two-step process there. The first step is essentially to be able to encircle Taiwan and conduct air operations against Taiwan, but eventually to become a full blue water navy able to project power across the world's oceans.
So I understand that China has plans to build 6 carriers, and this is to essentially match the US power in the region. How long do you think it would take them to reach that level or an ability to rival the US?
The US Navy still is the largest operator of carriers with a total of 11 aircraft carriers, but that's globally. So 6 aircraft carriers, particularly if they're nuclear powered and equipped with advanced fighter aircraft, I think would do that job. You also have to look at not just the aircraft carriers themselves, but also the supporting vessels, the destroyers, the cruisers, that sort of thing, which are all missile armed, as well as the land-based capabilities, including long-range missile capabilities. That combination of capabilities would potentially deny the US Navy and its allies the ability to project power deep into the Western Pacific, closer to China. If China can develop these aircraft carrier capabilities, they can gain sea control inside the first island chain. In other words, essentially have the ability to have total control over maritime operations in that region, and then undertake sea denial out to the second island chain and deny the ability of the US Navy to project naval power into the near seas within the first island chain. And that completely undermines US Navy operational capability, because most of the US Navy's capabilities are based around carrier-based air power, which all have short ranges. The US can't deploy its carriers close into China. It can't use that carrier-based air power effectively.
In Australia, as well as Japan, is there a change of thinking in terms of aircraft carriers?
Well, certainly Japan is going down this path. They are certainly developing smaller aircraft carriers. I think that possibly is on the cards for South Korea. Australia has two LHDs, landing helicopter docks, which can operate helicopters, but we don't have aircraft carriers. And I think there's a debate within the strategic policy community as to whether we should be looking at aircraft carriers. The other thing to be aware of is that the development of autonomous systems, long-range drones, that sort of thing, opens up a new way to employ aircraft carriers. You can purposely design a vessel to be essentially a drone carrier and to operate autonomous systems at long range. And you won't have to then worry about concentrating your fleet around the aircraft carrier to defend the aircraft carrier. So this is the primary problem with carriers, is that once you go down that path, you have to structure your Navy around defending that aircraft carrier.
And let me put this question to you, Wen-Ti. Malcolm Davis said China would gain control of the seas around the first island chain, that's the first step, and then secondly to deny access to the second island chain. Let's have a look at those island chains in terms of their geographic location in the Pacific. So there we have it. You can see the further out one, second island chain, goes through Guam. The first one obviously is Japan, Taiwan, down to the Philippines in terms of the central connections in that first island chain.
So I mean, the notion of island chains has utility for, I guess, U.S.-China military competition sense. So we can, in a sense, see these terminologies as how U.S. think about lines of defense vis-a-vis the PLA, especially PLA Navy. First island chain we know are places like in the northwestern Pacific, start from Japan down to Okinawa, Taiwan, Philippines, northern part of Malaysia, basically along South China Sea. Second island chain are those who are further back, closer to the US and closer to the center of the Pacific. Places like FSM, Micronesia, for example, or Caroline Islands. So in that sense, this is how US think about how big a sphere operation China's military will have under a contested US-China military rivalry in the Pacific scenario, which is why these are all very important factors to consider when you think about PLA military strategy. And I think for China, they want to have this sense that they have an ocean-going, a blue water navy, and to get there, they really want to be able to operate beyond the first island chain into the Pacific. And I think that's why Taiwan is critical there in terms of military utility, because Taiwan is right there, almost at the center of the first island chain, connecting it to Japan to the north, as well as Philippines to the south, which is again why Taiwan is often seen as a litmus test for the effectiveness of US regional deterrence.
So Professor, you can see there why perhaps a nuclear-powered feature would be useful when we get into stage 2, maybe stage 3.
Well, yeah, it could be useful because, well, eventually China wants to be a global power, but before that, this country wants to try very hard to become a dominant regional power. So, so there are several facets of power that China wants to pursue. So, for example, China's objectives ranges from protecting Chinese investment and bolstering the so-called soft power values or influence on other countries and collecting intelligence. And for counter-terrorist operations, and also to enable this country to become militarily capable to deter other adversaries in the region. So it is very important for as a tool for China to secure or to pursue a dominant stance in the region.
And Wen-Ti, you mentioned blue water navy. What does that mean?
It means the ability to go beyond the seas around one's coastline and to actually go into the ocean. I think that's generally what it means. So I think when we apply it to China, we're basically talking about blue water for Navy for China. It's basically China's able to operate beyond Japan, beyond Taiwan, and potentially also a China that can break out of South China Sea and enter into, let's say, Strait of Malacca, for example, or perhaps even going into the Indian Ocean, and in which case that's going to create some more fissure, let's say, some more potential source of friction between China and the other major great power in the region, that is India. And that's why I think why we're seeing all this acceleration of security cooperation with the Quad, for example, US, Australia, Japan, and India, increasingly finding common cause to find ways to work together as they think about how to best meaningfully and stably manage China's rise, including militarily.
Professor, let's talk about the Indian Ocean that Wen-Ti mentioned. You also mentioned that earlier. Tell me, are there links to China's relationship with Maldives, Sri Lanka?
Many people have already observed that China has successfully pushed forward its global strategy of Belt and Road Initiative, it has been quite successful because many countries wants to build this kind of a relationship with China, but there are also some negative impacts going on right now. So, for example, in Sri Lanka, the Hambantota port is in trouble right now because it makes the whole country get into the so-called debt trap, right? So, if this kind of situation continues, that means that China might be able to get more controls on overseas ports for the infrastructure that is necessary for China to pursue a complete blue water navy.
And is this all tied in, Wen-Ti, to something that Alessio Patalano has written about? He's talked about the return of the naval age. Do you believe that we're seeing this now? And if so, what factors are driving that?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think this global level, U.S.-China rivalry that's increasingly expanding across dimension, across region, is one major factor why power projection, as symbolized first and foremost by emphasis on naval power, is coming back to the fore at this juncture. We know that if we go back quarter century, back to, let's say, early 1990s, for example, people were talking about revolution, military affairs. People were talking about how improvement in information technology and all that are leading to a new form of warfare, focusing on cyber, focusing on satellite facilitated precision targeting and all that.
So non-kinetic?
A lot less kinetic indeed, for sure, yes. And now we're seeing China with its increasing global footprint economically and otherwise in other corners of the world, including, for example, in Djibouti, an African country now which has China's military base there, for example. With the increased footprint, China also has increasing incentive and drive to ensure that its military capability are able to reach farther and farther corner of the world, which again is why I think this new naval age, new emphasis on the Navy is coming back. Yeah,
so it's kind of like a rising China in terms of economically, but then as it becomes more powerful, as it maybe before this current period when it has economic woes, but it became more confident, and then it's become more aggressive in places like you said, the South China Sea. Professor, so we probably are seeing a return of the naval age, and let's also discuss, Professor, the last naval age. So if this is the return, when was the last naval age?
The return of naval age has very important features such as the technological advancement and innovation, and also the competition between China and the U.S. But in the past, the naval age, well, the most recent one was in the Cold War era. So it's competition or the rivalry between the U.S. and the USSR. Right? Something that the U.S. is also trying to learn from the past. Like, okay, so in the past they have been pretty successful in its policy of containment. So next, what should be done for making this new containment policy of China more successful? That's something that the U.S. government and also other regional powers are waiting to see.
Wen-Ti, is there a kind of echoing of history there in terms of this containment that China feels? If we go back to the naval age before that, maybe the sort of like the glorious naval age of the late 1800s, is there a link between that and China's century of humiliation?
I think it's certainly an argument one can make. I mean, if we go back to the late 19th century, for example, as you mentioned, we're looking at a world that had one maritime hegemon, in a sense, globally, and that was the UK, the United Kingdom. And then you had gradually a rise of Germany, a much more continental power that also over time wanted to prove itself in maritime domain as well. And maybe that's what we're seeing right now, with U.S. that's been ruling the seas, providing that global commons, that global public goods into the maritime stability we also seen China trying to do the same.
And what did those powers that you mentioned, there's also, you know, France, as well as Italy and the US itself, and even Russia. What was the relationship between those powers and China at that time?
A relation between those ones, well, it was much more contentious one. I think for China's century of humiliation narrative, as you mentioned, it's one that basically defined the relationship between China and the West as one in which the Western powers were practicing imperialism and semi-colonized China. And that's why I think when China's rising these days militarily, there's so much more nationalist sentiment. One could argue nationalist fury, a certain desire for sure to prove themselves that they are able to compete on both barrels of the gun. Mao Zedong used to say that power grew out of the barrel of the gun and barrel of the pen. If you look at the pen as cybersecurity and disinformation warfare, then we're seeing the other part, which is barrel of the gun, that is increasingly, we're seeing strong Navy, including aircraft carrier for China.
Professor Su, do you see the link between that? Is this what Beijing hopes is a revenge narrative?
Yeah, I think so. Beijing has several agenda, and then that's definitely one of the agenda that, you know, probably borrowing the narratives from Donald Trump is like making China great again, or, you know, trying to get China out of this kind of historical humiliation legacy by posing China as a great power in the world.
Okay, we have to end it there. Thank you so much, Professor Su and Wen-Ti, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.